So I want to start by welcoming everyone to the fifth iteration of the ACL Mentorship Program. And today we have two exciting guests or mentors who are joining us. Luciana, first of all, hi, I'm Vinodkumar Prabhakaran. I'm a senior research scientist at Google. I'm one of the co-organizers of this ACL mentorship program. And today we have guests like Luciana Benotti from Universidad Nacional de Córdoba in Argentina, and Tim Baldwin from Mohammed bin Zayed University of Artificial Intelligence in Abu Dhabi and the University of Melbourne. And I'll start with like a very high level sort of like the format that we'll follow for today's call, today's session. I'll start by giving both of our mentors an opportunity to introduce themselves and their research, but also with a starter question that is relevant to this topic. And each of them would, including myself, would talk for like say 5-6 minutes. The starter question, and then we will take Q&A from the audience. So students who have joined, please feel free to ask questions on the chat while Tim or Luciana or myself are talking, but also feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions when we reach the Q&A session. So I'll let Luciana go first. And the starter question, and this is the same question for all of us, is what are your initial thoughts on doing NLP on a budget, and how have you dealt with this challenge in the past in your own research? So maybe if you could first introduce yourself and your research and then answer the question, that would be great.
And my area of research are dialogue systems and systems grounded in vision and in movement and action. I did my PhD in this topic when both these topics were not so popular as they are now. Like dialogue systems is one of the tracks that is receiving more submissions at ACL. I was surprised when this started happening. So I did my PhD in France, and before that I did a master's in Bolzano with an Erasmus Mundus scholarship. And in France, I was lucky to have a Cordis grant that was a good grant that let me travel everywhere. I also spent my sabbatical in Stanford in 2018. But since 2010, I've been a professor in Argentina. So I have a broad experience having different kinds of budgets from the experience I just mentioned, a broad range of budgets. While I was a student, I was very privileged to attend all the conferences I wanted to, but that's not like that in the recent years. Especially around 2013, 2014, after returning to my country. I mean, I was born in Argentina. To my professorship, the country entered a deep economic crisis. And then most of the funds for research, and in particular funds for research that are not related to hunger and to health, got cut. So I've been with a very, very tiny budget for many years now. So I stopped attending ACL conferences for many years because of the budget restrictions that I had. And I started attending again and publishing again in this community when the pandemic started because of the virtuality. So that has been one of the ways. So in the meantime, I published in journals, and I collaborated with researchers in more applied areas, in particular in education, developing systems based on NLP for teaching programming to young students. And when I came back to this community, one of my strategies, because I was forming a small team, was to start by publishing surveys and position papers, and realizing that the work I did before and the things I've been pondering over the years were still very, it seemed relevant to the community, at least to the reviewers that accepted the papers. So now I'm really surprised, like, to be in the position now to have the honor to be the chair of the NACO, of the North American chapter for the ACL. And well, this is my personal experience and my initial thoughts when I saw this topic.
Thank you so much, Luciana. That is such a great summary of your journey, and I didn't know all of this, so this was great to hear. Tim, do you want to go next? Introduce yourself, talk about research, and also answer the question about how have you dealt with doing NLP on a budget?
Sure. Thank you, Vinod, and great pleasure to be here and to be able to play some small role in this fantastic endeavor, new mentoring scheme that ACL has put together. So kudos to Radha and Vinod and others for putting it together. So a bit of background. I've, I guess, been in the field for a long time, 25 years or so. I was at the University of Melbourne for 17 years up until a couple of weeks ago physically. I still have a position there. I still work very closely with the University of Melbourne. I still have many students and postdocs there, but I very recently, as in last week, recently took up a position as Associate Provost and Head of the NLP Department at the Mohammed bin Zayed University of Artificial Intelligence, as Vinod said, in Abu Dhabi. A bit of a change of pace and scenery, I guess. And reflecting on the sort of question about NLP on a budget, I consider myself very fortunate. The University of Melbourne, we didn't have, and to this day, don't have huge resources in terms of GPUs that we own ourselves. There was certainly a feeling of trying to sort of keep half a step ahead of the demand of the NLP group in terms of GPU usage, in terms of sourcing more GPUs or buying extra nodes on the GPU cluster, or sort of sourcing allocations on pre-existing sort of national level clusters with GPUs and things like that. At MBZUAI, it's extraordinarily well-resourced. We're probably one of the best resource universities in the world, I suspect, in terms of computing infrastructure. So yeah, experience here is sort of very different. It's possibly closer to industry. But yeah, having said that, it's something that I've thought about a lot, and particularly at the University of Melbourne have sort of dealt with a lot on various levels. I sort of wanted to reflect, perhaps not so much on personal experiences, sort of insights into the field or some analysis that I did. So I sort of started out thinking about, if you use ACL Best Paper Awards of the last 3 years, say, and it could be other conferences, I arbitrarily chose ACL, and look at the sorts of areas that they're in. Can we perhaps dispel this misperception that if you don't have access to GPU server farms, then you can't do research? And if you look back over the last 3 years, Best Paper Award last year was a green NLP paper. Yes, there's always this sort of irony in a lot of green NLP work that you have to benchmark yourself against more GPU intensive methods to establish how much more efficient your method is. So there is this sort of double-edged sword, I guess, in that to demonstrate the green credentials of your work, you kind of have to do the sort of gruntier, less efficient version in a lot of work. But the Best Paper Award was very much in sort of green NLP in terms of sort of more efficient, as in vastly more efficient tokenization strategies with a focus on MT. And out of the 6 outstanding paper awards, 2 out of 6 had little or no computation, as in one had almost zero computation. It was more of a literature survey of scientific practice in MT, particularly as it pertains to evaluation. One was a Mechanical Turk study, so again, no GPUs in sight. And one out of 6 was a sort of a GPU crazy paper, as in, only 2 or 3 or 4 organizations in the world could have done that work, but the others were perhaps more GPU standard. 2020, similarly, best paper award was the checklist paper. So again, it's not a GPU intensive paper at all. 1 out of the 2 outstanding papers was ours, and all of the experiments were run on Nitika's laptop. It was all IPython notebooks, no GPUs in sight, and there was 1 GPU paper. Yet similarly, 2019, best paper award was a modeling paper. Best short paper award, so best long paper award modeling. Best short paper award was an evaluation paper. Out of the outstanding papers, 1 out of 5 was evaluation, 1 out of 5 was a new task, 1 out of 5 was a theory paper, and the remaining 2 out of 5 were modeling papers. So if anything, over time, in recent time, despite this perception of everything is GPUs, the majority of the papers that our community is recognizing as the best papers are actually not GPU heavy papers. So I wanted to make that point up front, because I get it, and with my own students, I know this fixation on modeling. We've got to sort of build models, and if we're building new models, then they've got to be bigger than other people's models. There are all sorts of results sort of pointing in that direction, but it's absolutely not the case that either the most recognized work or the highest impact work is GPU intensive. And I think it's definitely the case that if you look at Google Scholar metrics, say, in terms of the highest impact papers for, again, ACL, say, over recent years, the very high impact papers do tend to be modeling papers, but that's not representative of the relative impact of modeling papers. They're very much the exceptions. The impact of your average modeling paper at NLP is actually quite small. They tend to have a fairly short half-life, citation-wise, if you actually do the analysis. And what tend to be the higher impact papers are the evaluation papers, or the resource papers, or the sort of insight papers, or new task papers. And if you look at the impact of different venues, LREC and SEMEVAL are sort of very high up there because they have the resource papers, and so they get a lot of citations as resource papers because people are using them. So I guess they were the sort of main things I wanted to say. Just as a sort of a side remark, there are efforts underway within ACL at the moment that Mohit Bansal is leading to sort of try to establish access to GPUs for those who really don't have access to them, to sort of try to remove some of the hurdles for those who aren't in at least somewhat well-resourced research labs, say. And I also wanted to acknowledge the fact that there are sources, modest sources of free GPUs through commercial vendors. And I won't name names because I'm certain not to sort of mention everyone, but you sort of can get GPUs that way. I've probably spoken for too long, so I'll shut up.
Thank you so much, Tim. Yeah, I mean, a lot of what you said resonates with me, and as you'll see when I talk about like my response here. But before that, I'll start with like a brief intro of myself. My background is in NLP as well, but I often worked at the intersection of NLP and computational social sciences. So often using NLP techniques or machine learning techniques to answer sort of fundamental questions in social sciences. In my prior work, like so I did my PhD at Columbia University, then I did a postdoc at Stanford, and then now I'm a research scientist at Google. So I think as Tim mentioned about his case, I think I've been very fortunate to have not had to worry about budget. I think as a PhD student, probably there were budgetary constraints, which I didn't have to worry about. I just had to do my research. In Stanford, Stanford, as well as at Google, like I have been at places where there was a lot of resources to run all sorts of like experiments, like if I needed to. The thing was, and I've always felt this, that most of the problems that drove me or that I felt passionate about didn't require a lot of resources. So I remember like the third year of my postdoc at Stanford, I'm like, there's all these GPUs sitting here and I have not even used it once. Like I'm an NLP researcher. I was always working on smaller amounts of data, looking at like some social factors. I mean, most of my postdoc work was on analyzing, I don't know, a few hundred conversations of police officers talking to community members and looking at racial disparities. So deep learning, like GPU-based approaches, were not really like the kind of weighted sort of like insights for which like there are other NLP techniques that are out there. So I've often felt that like I am in places where I had access to resources, but I was not utilizing them, or rather my research agenda was never sort of dependent so much on budget. And probably that, I mean, there was a lot of like things that I'm probably speaking from a lot of privilege, because, you know, I probably didn't face those issues because like many things were like taken, many hurdles were like taken away from me by my advisors or like other people. But having said that, like I do want to reiterate Tim's point that I think there's a lot of NLP research that can be done, interesting, impactful research that can be done, which does not require like giant amount of compute resources or even giant amounts of data. And thank you so much for sharing that analysis, Tim, because I myself had the misconception that like I still passionately believe that a lot of like GPU power, but I still perceive that like that those papers tend to be more influential or like more impactful, but that's also not the case, as I think as Tim mentioned, like there's a short half-life for many of the modeling papers. Yeah, so that's the main kind of sort of takeaway that I'll share, that I mean, budget can be constraints, and especially if you are someone who's interested in like modeling kind of research, that you might have to look into resources that allow you to do that research. But that's not all what there is for NLP. So do you want to add something to this before I go on to like taking other questions? You're muted.
Yes, yeah, thank you. You were cutting off for me just a little while ago. I don't know for the rest, right. No? Or...
Same for me, yeah.
Okay. No problem. So that's why I was a bit confused by the question. But yes, I wanted to add something. So when Tim was talking about the GPUs that are accessible, that will be accessible through ACL, for those that need them, I also remember to add that there are communities, like affinity groups, like Latinx or the Kipu community for Latin Americans, Mazacane for for Africa, and other groups like Queer in AI that also get resources, different kinds of resources, including GPUs for their members or for people that want to be part of this community, although they do not identify with a particular affinity groups. I mean, invited members are welcome also in these groups. In particular, I know of Latinx and Queer in AI that this is the case. So if you need GPUs for your experiments, you can reach out to these different groups or reach out to me and I will put you in touch with these groups. And also with respect to Vinod, I felt in particularly identified because also my research agenda was not so much dependent on computing power. So I focused a lot on error analysis. And something that is very useful for this kind of research is to have people release their trained models. So if people release their trained models, I don't need to retrain them. So I don't need computing power, and also I don't hurt the planet again. So that's something that I'm all in favor of supporting, not only to release code, but also to release trained models. I think this is very important for people working on a budget and also for our planet. So that's what I wanted to add. Thank you, Vinod.
Thanks a lot, Luciana. If my video or my voice is getting again jittery, like please ping me on the chat and like I'll turn off my video or something, or change my Wi-Fi. So now that we have had this initial sort of discussion, I want to open the floor to Q&A from students. Zijing, we can take students' questions on audio, right?
Yeah, I think so. And as long as on the YouTube, it might be like showing the speaker's view. So, but I think it's also an open place, so feel free.
Yeah. So if there are any students on the call who want to ask questions, please unmute yourself and ask. I also have some questions coming in through the Slido platform. So I can also read those questions, but if there's somebody who wants to ask a question here, please feel free to do so. That's a good 5 seconds I waited. So I'm going to ask a question from the Slido, but please do ask questions on the call as well. It'll be more interactive that way. Someone, anonymous, have asked the question, what is the correct way to answer a reviewer who asks for some simple but expensive experiments when there is not much more budget available? Tim or Luciana?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one.
Do you want to address this? I personally haven't faced the situation, but I can totally see the chat.
Yeah, if it's okay to jump in. So it's a tough one, and honestly, as a community, I think we need to do a little bit of reviewer education on this front. Yeah, definitely there are instances of reviewers naively asking for what are just unreasonable experiments in terms of compute budget, or there's no, I guess, conditioning on the sort of expectations of sort of different groups. If you're a Google, do all these experiments, and if you're a sort of more modest lab, perhaps do these. But perhaps more importantly, irrespective of whether you've got access to the resources or not, thinking about green NLP and our sort of footprint, there's always a fine line to be walked in terms of sort of good science and doing important analyses of the data or appropriate benchmarking versus just adding more results for results' sake because you can. So I think thinking carefully about which of those two categories the request from the reviewer falls into, as in, is it you could do this, it probably wouldn't really add much to the paper, and you definitely do get those sorts of requests sometimes, unfortunately, where if you have ARI, you can always do it as part of your author response, some statement to that effect. If it's a venue where you have author response, you can include that as part of your author response, of course. If it is in the second category of actually, it's a reasonable sort of a thing to request, but I just don't have access to those, that's when it gets harder, right? And that's where, hopefully through some of the sorts of schemes that Luciana was talking about, and the upcoming ACL scheme, you can get access to some of these resources, particularly if you have a good justification like that for wanting to get access. I guess failing that, you're sort of put in this difficult situation of sort of saying that, yes, I respect the request in terms of good science, but I just don't have access to that. It's an awkward one to have to put in an author response. I agree, but I don't think it's inappropriate to say that in terms of pointing out that the playing field isn't as level as people, perhaps in better resource labs may naively think it to be. And in the paper itself, there's always scope to have a limitation section where you acknowledge this, that, all things being equal, these are the sorts of experiments we would love to have run. We just didn't have access to the resources to be able to do it. We can speculate based on extrapolation from published literature as to what the results might have been if we were to do that. But expressly talking about this and acknowledging the limitations and kind of defensively saying, look, we know that there's sort of more experiments that we could have run. Here are the reasons why we weren't able to do them, but here are kind of guesstimations as to what the findings might have been. It can help avoid that situation to some degree.
If I can chime in, I completely agree with Tim that there is no shame in directly saying the truth. I mean, why you were not able to do those experiments. Some people maybe will not think of that possibility because it doesn't happen to them, right? So just saying what's your reality is good, and also kind of gives this reviewer more background on the kind of things that happen in other places. And also highlighting which are the contributions of the work you're presenting. I mean, and then the area chair and other reviewers can judge whether you have done enough work to be publishable or not because of other reasons, right? I mean, so it's not that one single experiment must be mandatory. If you say, okay, this is enough, this is the work I've done, do you think that this is enough to be publishable or not? So that's what I try to do in my responses. I mean, to highlight again the contributions and what the reviewers have valued with respect to those contributions.
If possible, I also want to ask a follow-up question. So we talk about budget in today's mentoring session. Apart from GPU budget, we also have human annotation budget because every MTurk takes money like that. So I understand for GPU budget, it's a question about like resources and like sort of the balancing research. But for human evaluation, it also feels to me like if some task, let's say a textile transfer or some evaluation which requires a more flavor of human, then doing the human evaluation is a verification about the model output makes sense. And sometimes reviewers might challenge, why didn't you do this human evaluation? Why didn't you do that human evaluation? Do we have possibly, some thoughts on that?
Should I go ahead?
Meeting being recorded.
Okay, so this is a great point, and in fact, it's something that is also controversial, whether some evaluations should be done using crowdsourcing, for instance. So in some countries, like in France, it's even illegal to use some sites for crowdsourcing because they do not ensure the rights of the people that work there. So this is really something, well, I'm also part of the ACL Ethics Committee, and this is something that it's in our agenda for discussion. And so regarding so now it's the default thing is to use crowdsourcing for evaluation. But before it was not like that. I mean, before crowdsourcing, at least in the community of dialogue systems, that was a small community, evaluations, human evaluations were done by the rest of the community. So we would say, we have our system here, could you please try it out? And we would do a community evaluation of the systems. Also, other researchers we're going to try out our systems and get more qualitative feedback on these evaluations. And I thought that was a great way to get informed feedback about our systems. And as a dialogue system researcher, I think that the current practices for human evaluation are very much lacking and that they should be reconsidered. That's, yeah.
Very much agree. I mean, on my end, I think where this becomes particularly relevant is if you're trying to construct some iconic large-scale data set, like a squad or a glue, or and absolutely for projects like that, annotation is costly, whether you use MTurk or otherwise. I very much second what Luciana said. That practices in terms of what is appropriate use of MTurk varies so much between countries, and I'd in the first instance approach anything involving crowdsourcing very carefully. Make sure you're sort of following whatever the internal practice is for your institution in terms of ethics approval or IRB approval, or whatever the appropriate approval mechanism is for your institution, if there is such an approval mechanism. Make sure you follow standard practice. So in Australia, we at the University of Melbourne, we had regulations that stated what were minimum payment amounts, in terms of minimal wage in Australia, irrespective of the country that the Turku was based in. So you sort of had to pay higher levels than what others in other countries were perhaps paying for exactly the same task, but for good reason, in terms of conforming with Australian law, even though it's a bit murky whether that's applicable in the MTurk case, because the worker isn't necessarily within Australia, of course. But the bigger point here, I think, is not everything has to be a squad or a glue or whatever scale thing. They're amazing data sets, and they've had huge impact on the field, don't get me wrong, but they're a bit like the the kind of the iconic pre-trained language model papers that we all sort of think of perhaps in this sort of discussion, that they're the outliers. Most of data set construction, you're never going to be able to build anything of that scale. And I would think more carefully about, well, what's the sort of minimal amount of data size that I need, and focusing very heavily on data quality and the data set construction and avoiding data set artifacts, because there's a whole set of issues in terms of naively crowdsourcing data sets. It's very easy to do it badly and waste time and money in doing it that way. It's much easier to do it with in-house annotators, working closely with them, developing annotation guidelines hand in hand with them, rather than sort of throwing it out to the crowd, whose incentives are very different to your crowd worker, of course. So yes, if you want to build those large-scale data sets, it's an issue, but I don't think we should be thinking of those in the first instance. And there's a lot you can do with existing data sets either way, in terms of exposing things about task definitions, as people have done with data sets like Squad or Glue, in terms of data set artifacts, or the definitions of tasks, or the perhaps the generalizability or lack thereof of the sort of base task that they're supposed to represent. So I don't think you necessarily have to have that as your first port of call either. That's the exception rather than the rule in terms of data sets.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the large amount of crowdsourced data, I think there's this expectation that, like, if we are getting from this platform, it's somehow like of a higher representativeness or more diverse data set, or it's not necessarily always true, because the crowdsourcing platforms themselves have all sorts of biases in like representation there. And I have some ongoing work like specifically looking into this kind of subjective differences across different groups of people in crowdsourcing platforms. I do want to move on to another question, but before I do that, I want to summarize that there's some questions that are coming in on Slido, about like Colab usage and getting more resources on like sort of Colab. I think basically getting more GP resources. What are the options there? I think Tim and Luciana covered that question in like the first part of the discussion. So I'm gonna skip that for the time being and like move over to the question that we got on chat. But if somebody had like more specific questions, like please continue to add on the chat. So the question that I have.
So I'll help Vinod read out the question. The first question we got from Zoom is, hello, I'm from a Brazilian university. Indeed, computation power is a limiting factor. Actually, I am working with deep learning models. Training or fine-tuning large deep dense models for specific applications usually requires significant amounts of computational resources. One way to ameliorate this problem is through data engineering instead of the algorithmic or hardware perspectives. What do you think about this approach?
I'm not quite sure what, Washington, you mean by data engineering in this context, but yeah, based on my interpretation of what you're saying, great, fantastic, absolutely. Yeah, anything which diverges from the norm. So if everyone's doing lots of sort of fine tuning and adaptive pre-training sorts of experiments and you're doing something different, great. You know, there's a chance that you're onto something novel, which the rest of the sort of trend chasing field, and you know, it's kind of a self-deprecating reference that's not picking on anyone, is looking at. So if you found an alternate take on the problem, which is much less compute intensive, where you can demonstrate improvements, fantastic, go for it. You know, the field loves these sorts of things, and those are the insight sorts of papers that I was possibly cryptically referring to in my comments.
Yeah, I completely agree there. In fact, there is an efficient NLP initiative that is supporting these kind of approaches. I mean, if you are using less computing power than someone else doing the same thing, so this is something that probably will, that you will be able to publish and that you will be recognized for. So everything that can be done in this direction, I think is very worth pursuing.
Great, awesome. And Vinod, do feel free to step in whenever it's good.
You can take over, Shijing, because my Wi-Fi is really bad. So please take over.
Okay, great. So the next question we got from the audience is, how do you go about searching I think it overlaps with what the panelists have already mentioned, but maybe we could have more insights. So how would you go about developing research problems while keeping in mind limited computation resources? While the examples provided are encouraging, but a lot of task-based research now require enormous compute, such as summarization, question answering, and so on. Yeah, I see the question more like, because our mentorship program is mainly for junior students working on research. So perhaps these are the questions that are the most concerning for them.
I can jump in again. So I agree that tasks that involve generation, that involves encoder-decoder models, the compute requirement tends to be much higher. So if you are in a situation of, you've got limitations in terms of what you can get access to, that's not the first task that I would be focusing on, honestly, because there's only so much you can do without access to some degree, at least, of GPU power. Having said all of that, consistent with what Luciana was saying about people releasing trained models, if you're just having to do inference rather than train models from scratch, the compute requirement is much more modest, right? So you can play around with it. There's a lot you can do in terms of probing trained models to understand why they work the way they do, or what the limitations of them are, or do comparisons of different models to sort of understand the relative strengths and weaknesses of them. And with more and more groups and organizations like Hugging Face, of course, releasing trained models that are relatively easy to sort of load up and or even having pre-computed outputs, if we're talking about sort of standard summarization data sets, or things like WMT, say, you've got all of the system outputs ready to download. You don't have to run in any code at all. You can just look at the outputs directly. And there's so much you can do in terms of doing archaeological surveys through the outputs of different systems to really understand the models. And our understanding really of the models is still fairly primitive, or sort of fairly superficial. So there's so much excellent work that can be done in that direction.
Yeah, just complementing that answer, also trying to propose ways to evaluate semi-automatically these kind of models. Like, for instance, it was also mentioned that it's expensive to hire crowdsourcers to evaluate this. So if you there's really a very intense need in the community for better evaluation strategies for the kind of systems that are exemplified here, like summarization and question answering, and in general, all generative systems. How to evaluate them is a real challenge.
Yeah, this is exactly the question that Vinod brought from Slido about a student doing text generation. And I know also many of us do evaluation on text generation. Like, do we imagine that there will be a certain stage where this can be automated, or like, yeah, it seems like due to practicability, maybe different people can only do a certain type of evaluation. Yeah, and I think we want to answer the question in the context of a junior student trying to do text generation as their task of NLP, and what type of evaluation they should adopt.
Jump in.
Well,
So, sorry, Luciana, if you're going to go.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, to me, there's no substitute for you as the researcher getting your hands dirty with the data. So often people go straight to Mechanical Turk or whatever, meaning that because they're not hands-on with the data, they're not looking over the data directly themselves, they miss out on key insights. And the annotators that they get through Mechanical Turk are only answering the questions that are posed to them. Perhaps they're observing things themselves, but they have no mechanism for reporting those back. So my advice would be absolutely do not go straight to Mechanical Turk. Absolutely do not assume that you have to do things at a scale where you have to use Mechanical Turk. You should absolutely start out with yourself, or with you and perhaps a small group of friends that you can perhaps sort of bring in to sort of do the annotation, to compare notes on the data. And only once you've established perhaps some preliminary insights into the data that you want to sort of quantify at larger scale. But even then, so many tasks are out there where you don't really need to do that at mass scale such that you wouldn't be able to do it yourself. Maybe it takes a couple of days, maybe it takes a week, but in the context of a master's or a PhD project, you can afford that, and the return on investment in terms of spending that time looking at the data is going to be absolutely massive, because there are just going to be all of these particular examples that you pick up on that you can discuss in the paper, and all of these sorts of insights into the data which can guide next steps in terms of whether it's extra evaluation that you're doing yourself or reflections back on shortcomings of the different models. So don't, if you read the sort of latest ACL papers, sure, a lot of people are using mechanical Turk, but don't assume that they started out there, or don't assume that you have to start out there. I think it's absolutely the worst place to start out with, honestly.
Yeah, I completely agree with Tim there. I mean, it's not cheating to look at the output of your system. You have to look at the output of your system to get a hypothesis on what's going on, and to, as Tim was saying, to get your hands dirty with the data, and also having a small group of people, and well, also as Tim was saying, and sharing notes with them, you can get very deep insights into what kind of abilities the system is learning and what kind of abilities the system is not mastering at all. There is a paper that has already several years for evaluation of dialogue systems using crowdsourcing, that they started suspecting something was going wrongly, because there were almost no clarification requests, no dialogues in which something went wrong, and they were trying to actually trigger that in the conversation. And in fact, they found that the crowdsourcers had dialogues like, I want to go from Buenos Aires to Seattle. And then the system was saying, okay, I found a flight from Buenos Aires to Germany, to Berlin. And is that okay for you? And the crowd worker was saying yes. So it was a different flight, not the one he asked for in the first place, but he just wanted to finish the dialogue. And the crowdsourcer found that the more than he agreed with the proposed flight, the dialogues were shorter, and then the task was ending earlier. And that's what the crowdsourcer was optimizing, just to make dialogue shorter. So it was not a good evaluation for the system at all. So we shouldn't. Yeah.
Sorry, reminds me of a somewhat random aside. Very senior person in machine translation, Harold Summers. He was very active in the 90s and early noughties, I guess, in particular, who spent quite a bit of time in Japan. And I remember him sort of telling the story about when he was learning Japanese, he would sort of say something and ask Japanese friends, can I say this? And they'd sort of say, yep, yep. And he'd sort of say something else, and can I say that? Yep, yep, yep. And found that his Japanese really wasn't improving. And he sort of really put people on the spot and sort of said, I'm fairly sure this isn't the way to say it. Yet you keep telling me that it's okay for me to say this. And the response was, well, you can say it. We wouldn't say it, but you can say it. So how you ask the question, politeness or incentive structures. I mean, that's a little bit of a sort of tongue-in-cheek one, but the point is incentive structures for Turkers and exactly how you pose the question are just sort of so critical. And particularly if you don't have access to them to be able to ask the follow-up questions about how did you interpret that question? Chances are the answer you're getting back isn't a direct answer to what you think you were asking.
Vinod, do you want to jump in?
No, I think I completely agree with all that is being said. My Wi-Fi was off, so I was taking a little bit of a break. Looks like it's fine now, but yeah, I completely agree with the looking into the data and also not going into the Turker route as the first route. I've also recently had instances where like we get like data that is completely off from what the data collection was intended to do, this. So I will now read out like another follow-up question from Slido that I do want to respond to and want us to respond to, which is about this human evaluation and data annotation from crowdsourced data sets, or in general. I think the question is, will we end up with NLP task annotation given each demographic background and eval by each subgroup? So this is a point that I wanted to get to when we were talking about crowdsourced data sets and the cost associated with it, that often when we get annotated data, we say human evaluation or human annotations, and since NLP right now deals with a lot of subjective tasks that is very much shaped by the lived experiences of people and like their socio-demographic backgrounds and their cultural backgrounds, the idea that like, you know, you collect data from like 5 people and like that is human, the idea that like crowd workers or annotators are interchangeable, that like just because it comes from a crowd, it just like it's a human, and so this is another human and they must be same. That is really a flawed assumption. So I really like the question, but I would love to hear from Tim and Luciana about like what could NLP do in order to sort of ensure we have like a more representative annotations or representative perspectives captured in our data annotations, while keeping in mind the cost associated with it.
I think this is a really hard question, and I do agree very much with you that the fact that crowd workers come from a crowd to make them interchangeable, and that they have their own perspectives, and that the annotations that they make are subjective to these perspectives that they have. So this is a tricky question, because then you need to start asking a lot of demographic questions from these people if you want to have this demographic background registered, and then you have privacy issues too there. So I don't think there is an easy answer there, and I would love to hear more and to engage in the discussion with what other people think.
No, I agree. I think it's a fantastic and very important and very big, more general question for the community. You know, this question of representation, representativeness of annotators or people that we're sourcing text from, you know, hopefully in appropriate ways rather than inappropriate ways, is absolutely something that we should be thinking about more. I mean, again, I'd come back to earlier comments about Mechanical Turk. I know in Australia, getting ethics approval to ask people for lots of sort of demographic information about them and their background would be hard. So, you know, it's not clear that doing it through crowdsourcing platforms is actually the way to go, and it's something that it's hard to sort of get right by accident, which is kind of what you're relying on if you're using something like MTurk. It's something that you really have to engineer into the data, which requires a lot of careful time and attention, and the ability to select your annotators rather than just rely on sort of opt-in and sort of the randomness that you're going to get through MTurk. And I guess, I mean, another dimension to this, and it's something that you hit up against equally in research on fairness and bias in NLP, that I know a number of us are involved with and care deeply about, that you know, if you identify particular dimensions of interest in terms of fairness and sort of carefully collect data sets, then you know, you can potentially get models which are demonstrably fairer with respect to those particular predicted attributes. does that mean that they're sort of fair in general? I don't know. What does general mean? What is a representative or a generalized set of predicted attributes? What is my general population? What is the particular population of users? Are there subpopulations I'm not thinking about where my model performs appallingly badly, but I don't have the data to probe and audit my model against to demonstrate that? So you kind of hit up against this big question of, can we construct data sets, or can we mitigate bias in our models in a way which isn't just specific to the particular dimensions that we've sort of engineered into our data construction methodology or our debiasing strategy, but which actually sort of generalize across subpopulations that we're not thinking about, where we've sort of got perhaps not guarantees or bounds, but at least sort of some sense that there should be some degree of robustness for other populations as well. We won't sort of have these sort of just heinous, embarrassingly just intolerable results that someone exposes 6 months later in our data set or in our models, because we just didn't think to look at the time. And it's a really, really important, and it's a really, really hard problem.
Thank you. We have more questions, but we don't have more minutes. So unfortunately, we have to wrap up this session now. We are at time, right at time. I want to again thank Tim and Luciana for lending their time and from various time zones, and so thank you so much for being here. And this was a really fantastic conversation. Thanks all the audience or all the students who joined, and all the great questions that you asked.